Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 9 of our reading of Pandora's Genes. This one should go live on April 11th, actually. I haven't been saying when these go live, but sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I keep a list here, as you can see, of all the videos I need to make and when they go live. But anyways, this is Pandora's Genes is a novel by Kathryn Lance, and it is part of a trilogy, with the second book being, well, this being the first, the second being Pandora's Children, and the third being Pandora's Promise. And as always, we are going to go over the copyright information. Here we are. It says all rights reserved, and the cover art is by Dave Mattingly. Anyways, it's also all rights reserved, but I have the author's permission to read this on my channel. I will add that. Okay, so anyways, all of last part was about the principal, the president, in other words. And he met with the generals. There was some squabble there. But he decided to get away on a little trip. He's dispatched some people to explore deeper the cult that has taken over the Southwest, and to explore further what happened to Zach. And he went on a little quest himself, unbeknownst to anyone, to check out a remote location that he had set aside for some purpose or another. And it's getting dark, and he found a cottage, I guess it's a cabin, that has a little girl in it of 13 named Lena. And he did decide to stay there, even though bad things are probably going to happen. So anyways, we are going to continue. We are almost to chapter 5. I didn't think that we probably had time to go through all of this, so. Okay. What's your name? He asked. Lena, she said. How old are you? 13. Listen to me, then. I would like nothing more than to stay here tonight. But you don't know me, even though I am the principal, and it might be dangerous for you. I'm giving you a chance now to send me on my way. You may have heard my reputation, and I am not gentle with girls. I only offer you food and lodging, said Lena. That will not be enough. She looked into his face, then her eyes widened with fear and something more. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. The principal thought for a moment, then went on. This has never happened before in this way, at least not since I took over the district. I have a very difficult job, Lena, and I work hard, harder probably than any other man in the district. When necessary, I fight, and my life is always at risk. I have few friends and very few forms of relaxation. The girl continued to glare at him. He could not guess if she was understanding him or not. He continued, It's known that I do not have a wife, and I do not travel with or keep women. Neither, however, do I keep boys However, I do keep boys from time to time. I require release. I require girls like yourself, young and unspoiled. You have not had a lover? Yet he suddenly demanded. No, she said in a whisper. Well then, if your fathers were here, I would give them money for you. A fair bargain, value given for value, and tomorrow I would take you to the city and keep you with me for a time, a day, a week, perhaps a month or more. During that time, you would grow to hate me because I would hurt you in ways that you can't imagine. When the time was over, I would see that you had a husband or husbands or were safe in the house of women for hire. If that is what you wanted, do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, she said. Her expression had not changed. The principal could scarcely breathe. Once again, he thought that he must ride away quickly before he made a mistake that might jeopardize his mission and perhaps his entire empire. But he couldn't make himself move and knew that all would depend on what she said next. She repeated, My fathers are not here. And your mother? She died of the women's sickness last summer. I'm alone. Then I offer the bargain to you, value for value. But Lena, if you agree, there is no turning back, and afterwards you will not be the same. For a very long while, she continued to look at him, saying nothing, then spoke almost inaudibly. I have dreamed of your eyes, she said. Stay. The principal thought once again of going on and then looking at Lena, young and vulnerable and full of invitation. Without a word, he followed her into the cabin. That sounds kind of bad. Okay, now we're back to Evie, looks like. As she skipped across the wet earth, bare legs under her long skirt, tickled by the tops of weeds, Evie reflected on the garden, that the garden was truly named. She loved the fresh plant and dirt scent in early morning when the sun broke the fog into a shining veil, softening the outlines of the lodge and smaller outbuildings and letting the bright colors of the vines on the wall run together like a tapestry. Ahead of her, on the left, where the orchard and the garden where the orchard and gardens just beginning their new season, and to her right, she could hear the animals stirring, beginning to look forward to breakfast. Here and there, a brave spring bulb thrust a pointed leaf through the ground, wagering that the last snows were gone. At the wide back gate, Evie worked the heavy metal bar into its grooves on the side of the wall. Smoke rising from the chimneys of the lodge kitchens reminded her to hurry. She pushed the gate open, then, taking 2 large buckets, stepped onto the crunching stubble of last year's grain field towards the stream. She filled both pails in the icy stream, and after carefully replacing the security bar, balanced them on a curved yoke across her shoulders. Work on the new well should be completed today or tomorrow, according to Gunda. Evie didn't mind fetching water from the stream. She didn't mind anything she was asked to do here. She was, after all, waiting. For the 3rd day of her arrival, Evie had been given her place in the routine of the garden, rising with the first light of day and helping the youngest children with their toilet, dressing and folding their bedding. This was no different from her life at home. Sometimes she missed her brothers, especially the thoughtful Dave. I think that's pronounced Dave. But it never occurred to her to think of going back there. After breakfast, if she was not on kitchen duty, Evie helped tend the livestock. She liked being with the animals, even those called experimental, and sometimes felt closer to them than to the strict and straight single-minded women of the garden. In particular, she liked the new goats, which were so misshapen and odorous that they were shunned by most other animals and people, but were loving and gentle when attention was paid to them. Evie spent most mornings cleaning the pens, feeding the animals, and talking to them, usually accompanied by Jimmy, a solemn, thoughtful boy who reminded her in some ways of her brother Dave, and by her fox cat. Through chinks in the flowered wall, she would sometimes look outside at the forest and think about her long trip here. She had grown taller in the months since she had come to the garden, and her body was starting to change. She had recently begun her monthly bleeding and found that with it came new feelings of impatience and longing and daydreams, which seemed as real and as changeable as the pictures in her memory. At night, as the children lay sleeping in rows beside her, Evie would lie with her eyes open, her body aching with fatigue, and remember Zach. This was her favorite time, when she was alone and could think of him. She kept the bracelet he had made her in her pillow to protect it, and only slipped it on at night, as if having it next to her skin made her memories of Zach more real. She sometimes imagined that she could see his face above her, the tangled blonde beard, his blue eyes with crinkles at the corners, and the hollow cheeks which always gave him a look of melancholy, even when he was smiling. Although she was always aware of the rustling of bed covers and soft breathing of the children, she liked to close her eyes and imagine that once again she was sleeping, snuggling next to him, feeling his strong arm around her, holding her as he had the night the bat had entered their cave. That night was the warmest and most protected moment of her life. In the days that followed, she had longed to sleep beside him again, but had never dared to suggest it. The day afterward, he had been awkward. Afterward, he had been awkward and almost formal with her, speaking in short sentences and avoiding her eyes. At first, she had thought that he was angry with her and finally asked him, "Why, no, Evie. Why should I be angry?" "Because I was afraid to sleep alone after the bat got in." His face had colored then, and he turned his head and slowly looked back. "I'm sorry," he said. "It had nothing to do with you. I'm a little tired, that's all." Looking at him, she could see that he wasn't lying, that he wasn't lying to her, but that he wasn't telling the truth either. She didn't want to disturb him, so she never mentioned it again. Although they had only been together a few weeks, sometimes she felt she knew Zach better than anyone in her life, even her parents. When new animals were born or a child did something funny, Evie imagined telling Zach about it and knowing just what he would say. Sometimes when the moon was shining, she would creep to the window and pull open a slat on the shutters to look out, wondering if Zach too, wherever he was looking at the moon and thinking of her. Repeated searches of the area surrounding the toll bridge had failed to turn up a trace of Zach or of the remaining highwaymen. Ermil. A further expedition to the cabin where Ermil and his brother had lived had likewise revealed nothing but the charred remains of a structure so thoroughly burned that the only sign of former habitation was a heap of stones where the fireplace had been. Carved deeply into the bark of a tree in the yard was a double spiral. Nothing further had been found. The mistress and Katha both believed that Zach was dead, but Evie did not listen to them. If he had died, what had happened to his body? "Wait for me at the garden," Zach had told her. "If I am able, I will meet you there." If he was not here now, he was not able, but Evie believed with all her heart that one day he would come for her. As the mornings were given to routine housekeeping and farming, the afternoons and evenings were devoted to study, lessons for the children, and mysterious work for the adults called experiments, some of which took place in the long, narrow building with many windows called the lab, and others involving the new grain and certain other crops of new plants. From the very first week, Evie was made to sit at lessons taught by a slender, white-haired woman named Mira. Sometimes they worked alone, but more often, Evie was part of a group of a dozen children, most of them, like Jimmy, a good deal younger than she. Her first father had taught her the alphabet, but like most children in the district, she had never learned to read and write. Literacy was, after all, associated with science and the change. At the garden, nevertheless, all children were expected to be able to read and write and work with numbers. Evie shrugged off this peculiarity. Just as she accepted the old experiments, she was certain that these eccentricities had developed as a result of so many women living without men. Gradually, at first, and then more quickly, Evie learned to read sentences, paragraphs, and then full pages. Mira gave her a book of stories from the very ancient past, and sometimes, while Evie was reading it, she forgot that what she was doing was a little dangerous, that it was work, and she began to enjoy it. The book seemed to be a window into another world in the same way that the chinks in the fence around the garden let her look into the picture memories of her mind. The story she read explained how things came to be the way they were. Evie learned that spiders weave their webs because the first spider had been a girl named Arachne who had been transformed by a goddess jealous of her weaving ability. She read about the inevitable punishment of the giant who stole fire from the gods and gave it to men. One of her favorite stories was about a beautiful girl named Pandora who had been given a golden box along with instructions never to open it. As soon as Evie began the story, she could see there would be trouble for what person could possibly resist opening a box, especially when told not to. Evie understood that these stories were only one way of looking at the world, and Mira spoke of others such as religion and history. She gave practical lessons, too, on the best way of growing plants and the uses of medicinal herbs, and one day an explanation of how men's and women's bodies work together to create children. 2 or 3 times a week, the mistress herself, who had been born not long after the change, came into the classroom to talk about life before the change. Evie had heard stories about the world then, of course, but never with the detail applied by the mistress. She and the children would sit wrapped with the old women's talk. The old woman talked about the society where illness could be cured, where everyone had plenty to eat, and where there were servant machines to take care of everything needed, lighting the dark night, making necessary goods, and even carrying people through the air. As the old woman's damaged mouth partially formed words, the classroom was in silent and deepest night, and all the children leaned forward, not wanting to miss anything. As she listened, Evie would examine the old woman's face, looking for signs of Zach. There was a little of him here, mostly in the blue eyes and the deep lines in the cheeks. At these times, she felt closer to Zach than ever. For some time now, Hilda had been borrowing the baby fox cat for her mysterious experiments. One day after class, the old woman invited Evie and the fox cat to come to her cabin. Evie was mystified but pleased. She had not spoken with the old woman since the day she had arrived. She brushed her pet's fur until it shone, and after feeding the new goats, presented herself to them at the mistress's cabin. Hilda and Katha were there, along with Lucille, the chief healer, and her daughter Lucky, a round-faced girl a year or 2 younger than Evie, who had shiny black hair and sparkling dark eyes. Lucky was sitting cross-legged on a stool in the corner of the room, reading a book. When she saw Evie, she looked up and smiled. Evie smiled back, and the younger girl giggled. As we suspected, the fox cat is extremely intelligent, Lucille began. We've tried every test we could think of, mazes, tricks, choice experiments. She learns everything at once. She also tires of any game very quickly. The important thing, though, is that we've become convinced that she's truly empathic. Evie frowned at Lucille. She had not understood most of the words and wondered if Baby was in trouble. Hilda caught the look and smiled reassuringly. It means only that she seems to sense moods or thoughts. I'd like to try an experiment with you. Evie's heart began to race. At last she would find out what the experiment was. She hoped that it would not last too long or be uncomfortable. Now, Evie, I want you to sit right here while I hold on to Baby. When I say go, try to imagine the most frightening thing that has ever happened to you. Imagine it very hard. Close your eyes and see a picture of it. Go. Evie shut her eyes and went back to the imagination to the scene with Oren. It took only a few seconds for her to begin to feel again the terror of that dreadful morning, the terrible expression on his face, the fishy smell of his breath, and the way his breath had changed as he began to tear at her clothes. After a moment, she became aware of a strange sound and opened her eyes. Across the room, Baby was growling and struggling with Hilda, who let her go. The fox cat came bounding across the room and jumped into Evie's lap, peering closely at her face and mewling. "Remarkable," said the mistress. "We must try to capture others," Lucille said. "There's no telling what we might be able to train them to do." Hilda and Lucille continued talking, their voices excited, but Evie stopped paying attention. The memories of Oren had been frightening and brought back her longing for Zach. She pressed her face into the sweet-smelling warmth of Baby's fur, while the little animal buzzed reassuringly. The mistress seemed to have taken a liking to Evie and her pet, and from that time on frequently invited them to visit. Lucky, too, was often there, and the girls began to spend more time together on the evenings, talking and doing needlework after all chores and studying what were done. Although Jimmy still accompanied Evie on her rounds with the animals, he became more and more withdrawn and finally began to avoid her company altogether. She was puzzled and hurt by this behavior, and one evening asked Lucky about it. "It's just 'cause he's a boy," she said, giggling. Then she added more seriously, "They can't help it. They can't ever grow up to be like women and learn the things we do. It's just the way it is." Evie was still puzzled, and the next day made a point of finding Jimmy after lessons. "What's wrong?" she asked him. "Don't you like me any more?" "You're one of them now," he said, his dark face solemn. "You go to her cabin every day. You don't care about boys and I don't care about any of them." It was true that Evie now spent most afternoons at the mistress's cabin, usually with Baby and Lucky. The girls would quietly do lessons or work at the loom while the old woman busied herself with the mysterious objects at her table, or covered flat leaf paper in tiny tracts of writing made with a bird quill and the ink of new plants. Baby, who hunted most of the night, usually lay curled and sleeping on one or another lap. Sometimes the girls would begin talking, discussing something they had read or some event in the garden that day. Lucky usually giggled infectiously, and after a few moments the old woman would shoo them outside, her face drawn in a fierce frown. Then both girls knew it was not in the least serious. When she was tired of lessons, Evie liked to peer into the more difficult books which lined the walls of the old woman's room. For the most part, they were much harder to read than her children's lesson books, and she still felt a thrill of the forbidden whenever she opened one of the heavy, dusty volumes and began to look at its crumbling pages. Her favorite was the very large book picturing the world before the change. The pages were covered with faded, astonishing images of cities with tall buildings and strange machines, animals and people of all ages dressed in fantastic costumes. The title of the book was The Best of Life. It seemed to Evie that indeed this magical time before the change must have been the very best that life would have had to offer. How she wished she had lived then. One afternoon, when Evie and the mistress were alone, the old woman startled her at her reading by asking, "Did Zach ever tell you why he brought you here?" Evie shook her head. He told me it was where he grew up, and that I would like it here." "Do you?" Evie stared at the old woman. "Yes, of course." "Are you happy with your work?" Evie shrugged. She couldn't understand why the old woman was asking her these things. It seemed to her that work here was like the work of humans everywhere, hard and necessary, and planting and gathering of crops, the trapping and hunting of animals, the making of soup and candles, and collecting oil for lamps, spinning and weaving and sewing, accumulating and bartering. The only difference was that here In the garden, all those things were done by women. There is a great deal more to the garden than you imagine, the old woman went on. You are doing important work here, work vital to the survival of the race. It's my feeling that Zach thought you could help us with it. That's why he brought you here. Evie frowned, not certain how she should respond. She thought perhaps the old woman's mind was wandering the way her first father's had before he died. You know, there are no boys past late childhood here, said the mistress. When they reach that age, we send them to the capital to work for the principal. The girls, with girls is different. In their 13, in their 13 years, they are given a choice to stay or to leave. Those who stay here, formally dedicated to the garden and its true purpose. Those who come here later, like you, must learn a great deal before making the decision. Mira and I feel that you are almost ready, but before we finish training you, we must know, are you prepared to dedicate your life to the garden and its purposes? Evie sat motionless, the carved back of the wooden chair pressed into her spine. She was confused and not a little frightened. I don't know, she finally said. You must decide, said the mistress. Evie felt tears at the back of her eyes. Like so many things in her life, this necessity for a choice was being thrust on her abruptly, with no time to consider. Then she realized what she answer must be. I can't decide anything until Zach returns, she said. Ah, child, you still believe he is alive. I know he is. We're going to stop that here. We are going to... Anyways, we have been reading from Pandora's Genes. It is a book by Kathryn Lance and part of a trilogy. It is the first book of the trilogy, actually. The second book is Pandora's Children, and the third is Pandora's Promise. Now, if you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. But you can possibly find your own copy of this book or any book of the trilogy at most of the big booksellers. There's probably still copies and reprints out there. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information is in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.